Anything Ghost, number 317. Welcome to Anything Ghost. My name is Lex Wall. Anything Ghost has been around since 2006 and is a podcast where people have been sharing their true ghost stories and local ghost legends. If you have one you want to share, send it to lex@anythingghost.com. We have stories from the Canary Islands to New Mexico, USA. So stick around for episode number 317. Okay, the first story we have is from Alfredo and Tenerife, Canary Islands. Ghost experiences from Tenerife. I've wanted to send you these stories for years. My name is Alfredo, and I'm a Peruvian listener, although I've lived in Tenerife, Canary Islands since 2001. My first experience happened a few years after moving to Tenerife. My grandmother came to visit, and she, my mom, my brother, and I went to the town of Puerto de la Cruz for some local festivities. We decided to spend the night there. There are nice hotels in Puerto de la Cruz, but my grandmother convinced my mother to save money by staying at a small old hotel. The building was really old, though it was clean, which is really what mattered. At that time, EVPs were trendy in Spanish paranormal shows. I had brought a recorder and used it often, trying to get good EVPs. It wasn't one of those modern digital recorders, but an old one that used cassette tapes. Since I knew we were staying at a hotel that night, I brought it with me in my backpack. My family and I had a good time at the festival. My story happened at night when we returned to the hotel to sleep. We had 2 rooms, one for my mom and grandmother, and another for my brother and me. Each room had 2 twin beds. We said goodnight and went to our rooms. My brother fell asleep quickly, and it was so quiet in that area of town that I decided it was perfect for experimenting with my recorder and EVPs. There was only one other guest in the hotel that night, and he was staying on another floor. There were no employees that night. I turned off the room lights and, aided by the streetlight, searched my backpack and took out my recorder. I used it with headphones. The tape I used for recording was a new blank tape. I usually recorded 10 minutes in silence, asking questions mentally, and listened to what I had recorded. Then I would record another 10 minutes before checking if I had gotten any responses. I kept at it for a while. In the recordings, I heard only the mechanical sound of the tape turning. At one point, a motorcycle passed by, and at another, a truck. Both times I approached the microphone to identify the sound that had been recorded. Otherwise, it was a very quiet area, and it was late at night, so really no sounds were recorded besides those of the device's small internal motor. After several more attempts, it was very late, so I decided to record one last time and then go to sleep. While silently listening to what would be my last recording, with the volume at maximum in case the EVP was just a whisper, I heard the most heart-wrenching scream I've ever heard. It was very loud, as if someone had screamed inside the room. It was a woman's scream. But it wasn't just any scream. It was as if she were being tortured or something worse. As soon as I heard it, I turned off the headphones and threw them away from me. I felt my heart pounding hard in my chest. I stayed looking at the recorder while the tape kept turning. I tried to calm down. Then I approached it, turned it off, and put it into my backpack. I didn't want to rewind the tape to listen again to whatever I had recorded. I didn't want to hear that scream again. I remember looking at the time, and it was almost 3 a.m. I decided the best thing was to go to sleep. And then something even worse happened. I was sleeping face down with my face positioned toward the window and my hands under the pillow. The bathroom and room entrance door were on the other side of the room behind me. I don't know how much time had passed. Suddenly, I was awakened by movement on the bed. I opened my eyes. I clearly felt how the part of the mattress that was on the side I couldn't see sank down. And something else. You know when you bring your hand to the side of your face and you can't see the hand, but you can feel it? I felt that. It was as if someone had put their knee on the mattress and was leaning over me, trying to see my face. I felt it very close, but I couldn't see it. I didn't feel any kind of breathing near my ear either. My eyes were open, but I felt so much fear that I couldn't move. I wanted to close my eyes, but I couldn't do that either. I stayed staring at the bed where my brother was sleeping. I wanted to wake him up, but I couldn't speak, only look at him. I was, as they say, petrified with fear. I had never felt such terror in my life. It was one of the worst experiences I've had. After a few seconds, I felt whatever was near my face move away, and I felt perfectly how the mattress returned to its normal position. I stayed quiet. I didn't hear footsteps. I heard nothing. I stayed in the same position, watching my brother, who kept sleeping. At some point, I fell back to sleep. The next morning, while we were having breakfast, I was still thinking about what had happened. Then, my grandmother told us what happened to her that morning. She woke up before my mom and went to the bathroom. While washing her face, she felt someone grab her by the waist. She thought it was my mom and greeted her, "Good morning, Susie." When she finished rinsing her face and stood up, she saw in the mirror that there was no one with her in the bathroom. She went out to the room and saw my mom was still sleeping in the same position she had left her in. It was then that I told my family what had happened to me the night before. Many years later, I returned to that hotel with a friend who was interested in paranormal topics. We went prepared with cameras and modern recorders. However, they had renovated the hotel, and it was much more modern then. We didn't experience or record anything. I don't know if the entity that inhabited that hotel had left. Years later, I had other experiences. When my grandmother passed away years later, it was a very hard blow for our family. I remember the day she died. My mother had traveled to Peru to be with her, and I was alone in our house in Tenerife. I was working on some computer when suddenly I heard voices in the living room. I went to check, thinking that maybe I had left the front door open and was hearing the neighbors' voices. But it wasn't. It was the television. It had turned on by itself, and there was a telenovela on. My grandmother really liked telenovelas and could spend hours watching them. It made me smile. I wrote to my mom to ask how she was. She told me she was still at the hospital with my grandmother, who had fallen into kind of a deep sleep. A few hours later, while I was still working, something strange happened. I was very focused on some technical problems we were having at work. I wasn't thinking about anything else but solving those problems. I was in what some call flow state. Then, everything stopped. I felt my grandmother was near. I couldn't see her, but I felt her very close to me. It was as if her presence was surrounding me. I could see her in my mind, but it was very different from imagining her. It was as if she was really in there with me, at the same time, sitting at my house in front of the computer. All my attention focused on her now. She looked younger. Right now, writing this makes me very emotional. I remember I started crying. I thanked her for taking care of me so much throughout my life, told her I loved her very much. I don't remember her moving her lips, but she told me she loved me very much too, and not to be sad. She seemed calm, happy. Then she disappeared. It was like waking up again in front of the computer. I was still crying. My chest hurt and my hands were shaking. And I saw my mobile phone. My mom had sent me a message a few minutes prior to tell me that my grandmother had passed away. A few months later, I was still sad about my grandmother. My mom had returned to Tenerife. One night, I woke up to a noise inside my room. It was like an animal's growl. It was loud and sounded dangerous. I stayed listening, but heard nothing else. A few nights later, it happened again. And then it happened again. The third time it occurred, I got up from my bed. I thought maybe there was a mouse or a rat that had gotten into my room. I looked behind my desk, where I had heard the growl, but found nothing. The fourth night, I thought maybe the animal was inside my air conditioning unit. I climbed on a chair to inspect it, but again found nothing. At that time, I was having tinnitus problems, so I went to a doctor. While he was inspecting my ears, I mentioned about hearing these strange noises at night, but he said nothing. He told me my ears were perfect, with no dirt or infections. A few days later, one night, I had gone to bed and was falling asleep, when suddenly I had another one of those experiences that I could classify as one of the most terrifying of my life. It didn't last long, maybe 1 or 2 seconds, but I remember it perfectly. I was in my bed, in the dark, when a large shadow, the size of a person, appeared over my body. It was floating a few inches above me. I felt how it pressed on my wrists against the mattress. I saw it. It didn't have any features. It was like a black shadow, much blacker than the rest of the shadows in the room. And while pressing my wrists, it screamed in my face. The same animal growl I had heard the previous nights. It was strong, threatening. And then it disappeared. I stayed in bed with my eyes wide open, looking at the ceiling, listening to my agitated breathing. I don't know what it was, but fortunately, I never saw it again. And then he wrote, a little note at the end. Lex, thanks you very much for your work on Anything Ghost. It's a wonderful show, and I always recommend it. I like to go back and listen to the old episodes, and I hope more people send you many new stories soon. Your voice has been a part of my life for many years now. A big hug. And thank you, Alfredo, for sharing those stories. Great stuff. And as I said at the beginning, Anything Ghost has been around since 2006, and I have a VIP group where you can have access to every single episode of Anything Ghost. It's a lot of ghost stories for you, and if you want access, go take a look at the Anything Ghost VIP group. There's a one-time membership fee. Go to anythingghost.com, join VIP. Batting next, Beck from Edgewood, New Mexico. The Unexpected Haunting. This story took place almost 20 years ago in San Antonio, Texas. My sister and her family rented a house that turned out to be very haunted. The house was only a few years old in a brand new subdivision, so they didn't have any expectations that anything paranormal would happen there. As kids, my sister and I lived in a haunted house, a story I will send at another time. So we were both very familiar with what that feels like, and there were no weird vibes initially. The house was an open concept that opened to a main living and kitchen area. As you walked in, you passed a narrow hallway that led to 2 back bedrooms and the garage. The split master bedroom and bath were just past a little alcove off the living area and faced the backyard, which had a small lawn but was mostly comprised of terraced steps of limestone blocks leading up to the top of the hill behind. My sister and I have always been very close, so I spent a lot of time hanging out at that house and stayed over frequently when I was babysitting for her, or we had talked too late into the night for me to drive home safely. The first thing I ever noticed was an odd feeling in the alcove area that led to the master bedroom. If I stood in that spot for more than a second, it felt odd. Crowded and ill at ease would be the best way to describe the feeling. I didn't say anything about it to my sister because I chalked it up to being a weird space rather than anything paranormal. It was small and lit only by the lights from the living room, so it was always dark and felt cave-like and claustrophobic at the same time. A few weeks later, however, my sister asked me if I ever felt anything weird in her house. When I confirmed that I did, she confided in me that she and her husband had been seeing movement out of the corner of their eyes in the living room, like people were walking by in their periphery. It always seemed to come out of the alcove. About a month after they moved in, when my sister and her husband were sitting on the couch, both looking down at something, I don't remember what now, they both saw a man in a brown hat walk out of the alcove. He then headed directly across the living room between them and the TV. Then he walked toward the far wall. He didn't acknowledge them or seem to be aware of them at all. When they looked up startled, no one was there. He began making periodic appearances after that, always following the same path. It freaked them out, but they didn't say anything about it to me or anyone else, wondering if they were both going crazy. I only ever saw him once. I was babysitting my nephew, who was a toddler at the time, and was washing dishes after he had gone to bed. The sink was in the corner of the counter that faced the TV on the back wall. As I had my head down washing, I saw him walk out of the alcove and stroll across the living room. He was tall, wearing a suit that looked like it was from the 30s or 40s, and he was wearing a brown fedora hat. I have my impressions of dark hair and a square jaw, but I don't know if my mind filled in those details or if I actually saw them. I jumped and looked up, dropping the glass into the sink, but no one was there. He should have been in the middle of the living room when I looked up. Every hair on my body was standing on end, and I was frozen in fear. I stood rooted to the spot, wildly looking around the living room and listening for any noise, but couldn't hear or see anything out of place. I took a deep breath to steady myself, then left the broken glass in the sink, and after checking on my nephew, who was sleeping peacefully, I sat in the guest room with my back to the wall until my sister got home. When I told her what happened, she hugged me and apologized for not telling me about him sooner, but confirmed that she and her husband had also seen him on several occasions, always in the periphery, and he was gone when you looked directly at him. They didn't really like it, but she added that he seemed to be in another time, not aware of them or the house that he was walking through. They had also apparently seen snatches of other people walking the same path. My sister added that it felt a little like living at Grand Central Station sometimes, and she said they were already looking for another place as soon as their lease was up. Then the noises started. The first time we heard the noises in the garage, my sister and I were talking in the guest room. The guest room was the last door down the back hallway that led to the garage and shared a wall with it. They used that room as an office and gaming space as well, so there was a desk with a computer in there, which required you to sit with your back to the bedroom door. We were looking something up on the computer, both with our backs to the door, when we heard a loud thump. A very loud thump. Thinking it was my nephew possibly rolling out of bed, my sister dashed into his room, but found him sleeping peacefully. We checked in the garage to make sure nothing had fallen, and walked outside to see if anything looked amiss. Nothing was out of place, and we heard no other noises. We assumed one of her neighbors had dropped something in their backyard, as all of the houses were close together and had privacy fences, so you really couldn't see their yards. We went back inside and sat down at the computer, going back to what we were doing. We were talking away when we both slowly registered another noise. It wasn't loud or startling, but it was persistent, so it slid into our consciousness slowly. We both trailed off talking and just listened, looking at each other. It was definitely coming from the garage, and it sounded like someone was rifling through a box or a drawer looking for something. We had just been in the garage looking for something that had fallen, so we knew no one was out there. We hadn't seen or heard any animals, though I hadn't ruled out in my head that a cat or a mouse had gotten stuck in a box in the garage. We both got a prickly feeling up our spines and both turned, not wanting our backs to the bedroom door anymore. I could feel the hair raising all over my body and my pulse started racing. There was a sudden sharp grating noise, like metal grating against concrete. It was extremely loud. It sounded like someone was shoving their heavy metal toolbox across the concrete floor violently with their foot. We both jumped nearly out of our skin. Without thinking, we ran to the garage door, and she threw it open hard enough to bang it against the wall. In hindsight, not the smartest move in the world. I don't think either one of us thought about what we would do if we came face to face with an intruder, but we acted almost on instinct. Nothing had moved. The toolbox was in its proper place, and there was no sign of anyone or anything. We'd thankfully left the light on when we went out there to investigate the first noise, so the whole garage was illuminated in bright artificial light. It was eerily silent enough to hear the hum from the fluorescent lights overhead. We backed out of the garage and locked the door behind us. I'm not sure why we did that, because we both knew at that point it wasn't an intruder. There weren't any more noises that night, but we were on edge until her husband came home. The noises in the garage, unfortunately, became somewhat regular after that. But it only ever happened when someone was sitting at the computer with their back to the bedroom door, and only when the house was otherwise still and quiet. It was always the same. It sounded like someone was moving around in the garage looking for something, followed by the sound of a heavy toolbox being shoved across the floor. The first time my brother-in-law heard it, he ran to the garage with a hammer in his hand, ready to do battle. But like us, found only the silent and empty garage. No one went out there when the noises started up after that, but they did keep the garage door locked at all times. I slept over less frequently after that, as things seemed to be ramping up and the house felt decidedly uncomfortable. The last time I slept over, I was lying in bed with my eyes closed when I felt the unmistakable sensation of someone sitting down on the edge of the bed close to my feet. I knew it wasn't my sister or her husband, and my nephew would have scrambled up next to me and snuggled in. They also didn't have pets. I kept my eyes closed and lay very still, pretending to be asleep, but my heart was pounding in my ears. I have no idea how much time passed, but eventually I felt the pressure release as though whatever or whoever it was stood up, and I felt the presence walk out of the room. Yet I never heard anything. No door opening or closing. No footsteps. The next morning I asked my sister if anyone had come into the guest room the previous night, and she confirmed that they had not, and gave me a very startled look. I suppose I could have been dreaming, but as someone who vividly dreams and has waking dreams, I know what it feels like, and this was different. I don't mistake dreams for reality. When I wake up, I know I've been dreaming. This felt stronger. It felt real. I decided to never sleep over there again after that. The last experiences I had happened the day they moved out. I offered to come help pack up and clean the house so they could get out of there. We got them moved out pretty fast, and then I stayed behind with my sister and brother-in-law to do the final cleanup. As I was cleaning the master bathroom, I heard my sister calling my name from the living room. I yelled back, "Yeah," to see what she needed, because I was cleaning the bathtub and didn't want to drip water across the floor. There was no response. I heard it again, but more insistent, as though she was holding something heavy and needed help. I jumped up and headed out to the main living area. The house was silent and empty. Everyone was outside, but the voice had definitely come from inside the house. I ran out the back door to where my sister was bagging trash and asked her if she had called me. She said she hadn't, and that her husband had left to go get something from the store. Apparently I looked white as a sheet because she told me to go sit down. I told her what happened, and we decided to clean together after that. We blasted some music and stayed in the same room at all times as we finished cleaning. My sister had scheduled the carpet cleaner to come at the end of the day so he could be the last one in the house. He was a small guy. This fact is important later. And he wore Converse shoes, which we noticed because most cleaners wear uniforms. When he got there, he was friendly and chatty and got right to work. We were happy to have him in the house, adding to the noise. He started in the back corner of the house, which was the master bedroom, and worked his way back toward the front door, so there wouldn't be any footprints. My sister poked her head around the doorway as he finished the master and remarked how good it looked. The freshly cleaned carpet was spotless except for the lined pattern left by the machine. We finished what we were doing and waited outside for him, so we wouldn't mess up the carpet. He came out the front door with his equipment and told us, "All done," in a cheerful voice. But he seemed weirded out, and he wasted no time in packing up and leaving. The next day, my sister and I went back to drop off the keys and do a final walkthrough to make sure we didn't forget anything. As we walked into the master bedroom, we both saw it at the same time. In the exact middle of the room were 2 giant footprints from either boots or men's dress shoes. It was just the 2 footprints, with no prints leading to or away from them, as if someone invisible were standing there. It was so bizarre, and it made our skin crawl. My sister said, "I think it looks great. Let's go get lunch," in a forced, cheerful voice. We ran out the door and got back into the car. We were still putting on our seatbelts as she pulled away from the house. It wasn't until we were at the stop sign at the end of the street that she turned to me and said, "Please tell me you saw that." "The giant footprints?" I responded. "Those were not there yesterday." We both shuddered as we drove away, happy that we never had to go back into that house again. My sister happily reported to me, a week after moving into her new house, that they were the only ones living there this time. We still talk about our experiences in that house. My nephew, who was a toddler at the time, didn't seem to have any experiences, thankfully, and he has no memory of it. The only thing we could figure is that whatever is there is tied to the land the house is built on, possibly amplified by the limestone that surrounds it. It is also possible that someone living there before her was playing with a Ouija board or similar conjuring tool and opened up a doorway they neglected to shut. Since getting into paranormal more, I've heard numerous stories, even some on this podcast, that talk about seeing a man in a hat. I now wonder if it was tied to him, whomever or whatever he is. Thanks for the great podcast, Lex. My husband and I have been loyal listeners for about 4 years now, and we look forward to each new episode. We also joined the VIP group and are working our way through the archives. We both have had paranormal experiences and can hopefully contribute more stories in the future. Keep up the great work. And thank you for sharing that wonderfully scary, creepy story, Beck. And I was amazed there were some similarities between your story and the previous story. But yeah, if you have any more stories, send them in. We'd be glad to hear them. The next story is from Richard in the U.S. Bizarre Hauntings from a Possessed Foster Child. I'd like to share a true story about my family's experience with what I believe was a haunting that persisted for 5 years. The activity began suddenly after temporarily fostering a child who claimed to be possessed. She described seeing a woman in mirrors whom she believed could control her if she looked too long. During a confrontation, she displayed an unusual amount of strength, shoving me, 225 pounds, down a hallway as if I weighed nothing. She screamed and made noises, seeming completely unlike herself. Shortly after she was removed from our home, the paranormal activity began. Lights turned on and off by themselves, closet doors opened on their own, and objects moved without explanation. At night, our bed would be kicked or even jump up and down audibly. On one occasion, a glass exploded in the sink with no apparent cause, and I frequently woke up covered in unexplained marks on my arms and legs, which I documented with photos. My son experienced something getting into his bed with him, and later hearing and feeling an exhale on the back of his neck while playing, an event captured on our home security camera. We moved homes twice in an attempt to escape the activity, but it followed us. Doors opened and closed without explanation, and voices could be heard. On one occasion, the entity clearly said, "Watch it." A moment also caught on video. It also mimicked sounds such as a baby crying or a dog barking, and banged on walls to get our attention. Another unexplained event involved a handwritten note in the handwriting of the former foster child appearing on the floor of my office a year after we moved, even though she had never been in that location. On several occasions, objects moved in plain sight, including a bottle of sriracha that slid across the countertop. And thank you, Richard, in the U.S., for sharing your personal haunting stories with us. And we all hope that you and your family have been able to move on without this thing following you. And the next story I have, I'm going to reach into my archive bag, and it was from Erica in South Carolina, and someone had recommended it from the Anything Goes VIP group. They were looking around for it, and they found it, and they said, "Oh, here it is." And so I thought I'd read it for you instead of playing the original recording, because it was way back in episode number 33. But again, it's from Erica in South Carolina. An eerie fog. I just recently found your podcast, and I've been listening to all the episodes as fast as I can download them. I love hearing about all those creepy experiences people have had. I haven't experienced anything myself, sadly, but my fiancé and best friend had a strange encounter about a year ago. I know you prefer personal stories, so I had to have him type it up. And here's his story. I joined Sarah that night for a long, aimless drive, as we like to do on such occasions when we have sufficient free time. And as usual, our uncharted path took us out of the city, miles from skyscrapers and patrol cars, and into the hearts of the sticks. This was generally the sort of thing we were looking for, to get away from the urban claustrophobia and into the wild, open spaces. We were on our way home, and having missed our exit, Sarah and I found our car wading through a shallow bank of fog that was, by all accounts, completely out of place. There was no dip in the road, no nearby river or swamp, nothing whatsoever that would accurately explain the presence of a narrow wall of mist that covered a mere 10-foot road and refused to dissipate, even on a lukewarm 70-degree South Carolina summer evening. That was our first indication that something was amiss. There had not been a single wisp of fog anywhere else on the road, even in places where there ought to have been, such as crossing rivers or swamps and such. But we continued on, because even if it was a little creepy, we weren't afraid, because we were in our car, and everyone knows ghosts can't touch a fast-moving car, right? That's when everything became truly frightening. Beyond the fog bank, the whole world changed. There were no other cars on the road, no houses on either side, not even a single piece of litter to suggest that humans had ever traversed on this path before. The air was still and heavy, even inside the car, and the darkness seemed more oppressive than usual. The only illumination anywhere that I could see came from the headlights of our car. We both stared out into the blackness, the thrill of foreboding heightening our senses. Suddenly, as I turned from my window and glanced out the driver's side window, I saw a flash of white, and in that flash, I caught a very clear and bone-chilling glimpse of what was obviously a human being. A tall, pale man with hunched shoulders, his hand stretched out to us and standing no less than 2 feet from the driver's side door. But in the next instant, he was gone, leaving nothing but a cold chill clinging to my spine. I was about to mention my sighting when Sarah said, "Whoa, did you see that house?" I blinked, confused. "No, what house?" "That house over there," she indicated in the direction of my window, from which I had been staring intently out for the previous 2 minutes. But I had seen no house. "I didn't see any house. Did you see that man?" Now it was her turn to blink. "What man?" "The man standing, right outside the door. He was in the middle of the road. You must have seen him right before we passed by." She shook her head. "I didn't see anyone. Are you sure he was there? Because I was looking all around and all I saw was that house. It was all lit up with lights on the porch and in every room." I replied, "Well, I was looking all around too, and all I saw was that man." Silence reigned for a moment while we both pondered the implications of our conflicting stories. Clearly one of us is wrong. The only way to prove which one is to repeat the experience. Let's turn around. We stopped at a small intersection, right underneath the ominously looming branches of a long-dead dogwood that could not have been described as doing anything except reaching down for us. We couldn't wait to get out of there, but we had our mission first. Sarah gestured toward the road in front of us. "Look out my window, and I'll look out yours. You see if you see that house, and I'll keep my eyes open for the man." I nodded, and we took off down the road at a slightly slower clip than before to aid in our search. Minutes passed, and the land on either side of the road remained empty, perfectly empty. Imagine the thrill of terror we both felt as we came upon the same bank of fog that we had passed through before, with neither of us having seen what the other had. Sarah said, "Now, I don't see the house either." I nodded and replied that I didn't see the man again. We sailed through the fog bank, no more willing to stay in that area than we would have been to climb out and search on foot for the ghostly man. As soon as we passed through the mist, the world reverted to normal. The air thinned, the darkness lifted, and we rejoined the civilization. City lights once again illuminated the night sky, and the only evidence we had to suggest anything had been unusual was the nagging chill that still clung to our bones and trembled in our hands. On a later date, we returned to the site again. We wanted to determine whether what we had seen was real or not. But this time around, there was no fog, and the road beyond the exit was as urban and as human as we would have expected, with trash littering both shoulders and houses sitting back from the road, though not so far back that we could not have seen them the previous night. At the spot where Sarah had seen the illuminated house, there stood nothing but a signpost that suggested something had been there once, a long time ago, but no longer stood on that spot. And where I'd seen the man, there was nothing. The only part of the night that remained was the gnarled dogwood still hanging over the road, still threatening to grab the car, and tacitly confirming what we already knew in our deepest fears. We had taken a trip down a haunted road, and the occupants had come out to say, "Hello." And again, that was an old story from episode number 33 of Anything Ghost. And I guess the driver missed the signpost up ahead. Yeah, it had a Twilight Zone feel to it. It was very well written, I think. Okay, so I have one more thing to share, and it's an article from 1930 in Hyde, England. Waiting and Listening on the Haunted Road. And this news article from 1930 is an example of what paranormal investigations were like and thought of in the early 1900s. Spiritualism, the practice of contacting the dead through a psychic or medium, had peaked from the 1840s up until like the 1920s. And in fact, it got to such a degree of popularity that in February of 1926, legislation was put forward by the U.S. Congress in an attempt to control the industry. They believed many of them were stealing money from citizens by using ghostly tricks and lying about contacting past loved ones. I believe there were some honest psychics, but most were just jumping on the bandwagon and making money from mourning individuals. And as spiritualism grew, so did a faction of people who wanted to prove it was all a fraud. One such person was Harry Houdini, the famous illusionist and stunt performer. He dedicated his later years into shedding light on the tactics used by the psychic performers. But in February of, like I said, 1926, during the debate of the aforementioned legislation, it was H.R. 8989, things got really heated between the spiritualists and Houdini. You know, in the Capitol and in the halls, there was a lot of yelling and waving. But one in particular was named Marcy Champney. She was a psychic who had supposedly predicted just a few years prior the election and untimely death of President Harding in August of 1923. And at one point, Houdini questioned Champney's legitimacy, and she pointed to him and said that he would be dead before November. And that was again in February of 26. And after all of the hoopla, the bill never passed the House. But Houdini continued his work to try to prove fraud in the industry. Oddly enough, he passed away on October 31st of that year, before November. So that kind of sets things up, how life in the paranormal industry was going around the time that this article came out. It was 4 years later, in 1930, and this was in Hyde, England, waiting and listening on the haunted road. A short, sturdily built man stood on the bleak Cheshire hilltop before dawn today. His face was turned toward the stars. His fingers clasped a slender twig of hawthorn. The man was Mr. E.W. Oaten, president of the Spiritualist International Federation of the World, editor of Psychical Weekly, and a lifelong investigator of abnormal phenomenon. He and I were probing the mystery of the haunted road near Hyde, the smooth, straight road where, in the past 8 years, scores of apparently inexplainable motoring accidents have occurred, some of them fatal. At an inquest on a motorcyclist who was killed on the haunted portion of the road, a stench of about 300 yards, a phantom lorry was mentioned as a possible cause. The coroner himself, a savage dog which slunk back to its master, whimpering and cowed, after being sent to find the invisible walker. I have never held a stranger experience than was provided by these hours with Mr. Oaten on the windswept road. It was like living a ghost story, even though I saw no ghost. For Mr. Oaten, during his search for psychic influences, told me that he could see gnomes and fairies, and that he was in communication all the while with a friendly guiding spirit. Let me relate our adventure from the beginning. It is 9 p.m. in the parlor of the New Inn. Men and women are seated before a blazing fire. They talk of many things, but invariably return to one subject: the haunted road that lies not far away, like a river of ink under the starlit sky. Some of the men who have to pass along the road on their way home carry thick sticks. Outside, the wind is rising. It beats against the walls of the inn and plays a moaning tune among the telegraph wires. But the little parlor is cozy and cheerful, and Mrs. Grattan, the licensee's wife, is smiling as she bustles to and fro among her customers. It was the dog of Mr. William Grattan of the New Inn, an Airedale from the kennel where police dogs are trained, that was terrified by the ghostly footsteps in the yard. The Airedale is dead now. It was killed on the road in front of the inn. 2 other dogs and 2 other cats belonging to Mr. Grattan have died in the same way. An elderly man stretches his hands toward the fire and speaks in a low voice. Do you remember the time when 4 people were knocked down by a motor car on the road yonder? That was a queer affair. The driver said he had not a glimpse of them until they were nearly under the wheels. Aye, says a woman, I remember it well. That was the first time I ever heard the footsteps, as I was walking over the hills from Mottram Way. But I came to no harm. She laughs, a scared, breathless little laugh. For some minutes the ghostly footsteps are talked of. All who have heard them are in agreement. They are slow, measured steps, ringing out sharply on the road's surface. And almost invariably, soon after the footsteps are heard, there is an accident somewhere within the fatal 300 yards. You would not take him, at first glance, for a psychic investigator. He has a closely trimmed white mustache, twinkling eyes, and a businesslike manner. The most interesting thing about this affair, he says briskly, is the story of the terrified dog. That incident, coupled with the fact that the hauntings are in an open road, are by no means uncommon. Makes me think the case is worth looking into. Cats and dogs are much more sensitive to psychic influence than we are. Now I should go up to the road alone to spy out the land. He rises, smiles, and is gone. Once again, I settle down to listen to the stories told in the brightly lighted inn parlor, to the stories of a measured footstep in the night, a crash, a cry, a dazed motorist asking, "How did it happen?" Then, midnight. Here on the road of death, it is very dark. On either side, tall bushes stand out in fantastic silhouette. The wind is stronger than ever. A savage gust comes howling over the hill to meet me. Dimly at the summit of the road, I see Mr. Oaten, walking slowly to and fro. As I draw near, I see a hawthorn twig held between his gloveless hands. After a few moments of silence, he tells me that he is using the twig as a sort of psychic divining rod. He had cut it from the hedge 5 minutes before. "I do not think any influence is at work here tonight," he said. "I am applying 3 tests. Except that I am using a hawthorn twig as a substitute for a hazel wand. It will serve just as well." Midnight is well behind us, and we have seen no phantom lorry. Twice from the direction of Mottram, motor cars approach. They slow down as they enter the section of roadway where we stand, and go to a crawl until out of sight. Mr. Oaten walks a few yards away from me. I hear him whisper a sentence or two and strain, without success, to catch his words. He beckons me and leads the way to the roadside stile. We pass into a patch of steeply rising ground and stand there, listening. Once again, no sound comes to us except the shrieking and sobbing of the wind among the bushes. "Have you seen anything at all?" I shout. "Yes," Mr. Oaten replies. "But what I have seen so far is nothing out of the ordinary in a country place, if one is clairvoyant. I have seen some fairies." He holds up his hand and spreads his thumb and index finger wide apart. "About that size," he adds. Suddenly, the wind changes direction, and its roar dies away. Out of the silence grows a sound which makes me catch my breath. It comes out from the left, from the direction of the road, and it sounds like a footstep, like the slow, heavy tread of a powerfully built man. Mr. Oaten is pacing to and fro again, the hawthorn twig between his fingers. He does not speak, and seems not to have heard the sounds which startled me. A motor car sweeps into view, its headlights flooding the roadway. I hurry toward it. As I reach the road, the car goes by. In safety. There is no crash. Then, straining my eyes through the darkness, I see where the strange sounds are coming from. On the opposite side of the road is a windmill on a high steel tower. As the wind springs up again, the sails revolve, emitting a rhythmical clanking sound, very like a heavy measured footstep. I decide that at least some of the ghostly footsteps had come from the windmill. But there is still so much to explain. What about the long chain of mysterious accidents which so puzzled the coroner? Mr. Oaten, when I rejoin him, says, "I'm quite sure there is no haunting influence here tonight. At the moment, there is no reason to believe that the accidents have not arisen from some undiscovered normal cause, unless, that is, the haunting occurs only at certain hours and at regularly defined periods." We walked off down the haunted road. A man comes toward us out of the darkness. As he enters the haunted 300 yards, he breaks into an urgent trot and keeps running until he is beyond earshot. In the car, I say to Mr. Oaten, "While we were on the haunted road, I thought I heard you whispering. Was it an incantation?" Mr. Oaten laughs. "Oh, no. The man who came down with me made me talk, although I was trying to make him talk." I glanced around in alarm. "You see," says Mr. Oaten, "I never go on an investigation of this kind without the guidance of a friend who is on the other side. He was helping me tonight." Accepting a cigarette, Mr. Oaten lights it calmly and sinks against the cushions. And there's that. And I looked up some of the streets mentioned in that article, and from what I can tell, it's all industrial now, so I guess the haunted road is no longer. I don't know for sure. But also I looked up the spiritualist Mr. E.W. Oaten, the paranormal investigator, and he stayed on with working on the paranormal. In fact, he's still talked about somewhat today. I saw him on a Facebook page. I don't think it was for him. I think it was spiritualist Facebook page. And I also found there's a recording of him in 1934 talking about some of the spiritualist adventures. So he passed away in 1952 at the age of 76. And that's it for Anything Ghost number 317. Hope you all had a good time. And it's the hour-long show. We haven't had that in a while. And until next time, I'll talk to you in show number 318. Have yourself a wonderful week and take care.